Well, welcome to the latest episode of the Lonely Report in another busy week of royal news about various members of the York family. We'll be talking about the investigation into Andrew and where that is now, into some of the new victims who are coming forward, into the changed relationship between the daughters and the rest of the royal family, and wondering what Sarah Ferguson may do next.
So one of the big stories this week, Andrew, is the news that Priti Patel, when she was Home Secretary, blocked the mutual legal treaty assistance request from the Southern District of New York to interview Andrew. What do you think the significance of this is?
Well, I thought that was very interesting, that story. I did write about the blocking of the Mutual Legal Assistance Treaty. I thought that that pressure had come from the palace in some ways, but it now seems to have come from the Home Office. The Home Office, of course, feeling they needed to protect the royal family. I mean, it's interesting how things have changed since then. But I think it has caused problems because we're now getting a situation where the American authorities are not being very cooperative with the British. I thought it was very interesting that Mark Rowley went across the States last week. He was very keen to get unredacted emails. And it does look like the Met and other police forces are now finally taking this seriously. And it's very frustrating to feel that the Americans now are kind of playing tit for tat with the British and are not being very cooperative. Because at the end, this is about getting justice for the various victims and holding people like Andrew Mountbatten Windsor to account. So I just hope that, become a little bit more grown up. But Priti Patel, of course, has all sorts of very interesting connections to some of the people in this story, very, very close connections, particularly in Israel. And, I think that I'm amazed that there hasn't been more reaction to that mirror piece in the mainstream media. Huge reaction on social media. But I just wonder what's going on behind the scenes there. But it is very frustrating to feel that government officials are still protecting Andrew on both sides of the Atlantic.
And do you think the Southern District of New York is potentially looking at new charges? And do you think if a new similar request came through this year, that the British would be more forthcoming?
Well, I hope so. I mean, I think, the fact that the Met, who claimed to have looked three times and said there was no case to answer, are now doing so seriously, will encourage others to do so. I understand that Audrey Strauss, who was the prosecutor for the Southern District, had gone a long way and they'd actually passed a file to the Met in 2022. So I think the problem is a lot of these people have now left those posts. A lot of them, of course, very political, very different situation now under the present administration. And I think that is one of the really worrying things, that this has become a very politicized issue, that the DOJ and others are continuing to protect Trump and his acolytes at the cost of justice being done.
So do you think there's a bit of a paradox here? On the one hand, it seems that Andrew's kind of the fall guy. So there's much more coming out about him from the Epstein files than there is about some of the other big names, like, for example, Bill Gates. So on the one hand, he's kind of the fall guy. But do you think also he is being protected potentially by Trump and by the DOJ?
Yes, I mean, it is interesting that there haven't been more disclosures about other people because the material is there. I think it's people are scared. I suspect people have had pressure put on them, and that's not been the case here. I mean, former Prince Andrew never replies to any of the allegations made against him, and so it's sort of open season. I do think that he is still protected. I hear all sorts of stories about pressure being put on civil servants and policemen, reminding them of their obligations of confidentiality. I think there's a lot of window dressing going on in terms of cooperation with the police, and I'm not sure that really is happening because the last thing the palace want is for this can of worms to kind of be opened, because I think it's going to lead to all sorts of other figures in the royal family and other stories, apart from the reputational damage it does just with the Andrew material. So it's I think they're trying to keep a lid on this story. I mean, there's some really interesting things going on. Why are Beatrice and Eugenie now being distanced from the royal family very openly? Lots of briefing going against them. Is that kind of to create a firewall between the family and the royal family, kind of distract attention? They kind of become the punch bag to say, for example, the king being the punch bag. I just don't know. But there is an awful lot of stuff going on behind the scenes, which I'm still trying to understand the significance of.
So yeah, there's another kind of interesting subplot, isn't there, with Beatrice, in that a new reality show, Ladies of London, featured allegations against the mother of Beatrice's husband's child that she was a madam.
I don't know if there's any truth in it. Sounds very unlikely to me. But, certainly when I was researching the entitled, there are a number of actually quite prominent women in London society who do have a background. There was one who's providing girls for Andrew in the early 2000s. So it doesn't surprise me. And I think one of the interesting things again was to discover how many women quite voluntarily slept with Andrew in this period, but quite a lot of quite well-known figures, actresses and models, were also paid to sleep with him. I have a story in the upcoming paperback about a former Miss Slovakia, for example. So I think that's what's so intriguing about this whole drama, really, and scandal, is it just gets getting bigger and bigger, and more really extraordinary revelations keep coming out. And the net gets wider and wider. I'm told, but there are a lot of very terrified people in London society because they've got a lot of secrets which they're worried are now going to emerge. And of course, we have all the rumors that Sarah Ferguson is going to do a memoir. She's going to throw everyone under the bus, including other members of the royal family, in order to save her own skin. And though the stories are that no one was interested in buying that memoir, I'm not sure that's true. I'm sure a story that really had a lot of sensational information would be a bestseller. I'm sure someone would buy it, even if it was an American publisher shipping copies into Britain. So I do think this is very dangerous territory for the royal family. There's a huge appetite for royal scandal, and there's a lot of loose cannons now running around who can provide it.
Yeah, and there was another link to that show 10 years ago. There was a famous society model called Annabelle Nielsen, who was linked to Epstein in the recent papers. She died fairly young in her late 40s, I think, but it turned out in the Epstein papers it looked like she was procuring women. So again, there seem to be all these tantalizing hints of madams in British high society that may have had links to this Epstein circle.
Yeah, well, one of the interesting things I've found in the recent research is that Andrew was providing women to Epstein, a lot of his former girlfriends. So there's one woman I've been talking to who I just assumed was a girlfriend, but she said that she was an effect of Andrew, and quite a wealthy and independent woman with her own career. And she claims that she was trafficked to Epstein and fell into this very abusive relationship there. So I think it's a much more nuanced picture than of just teenage victims from Florida schools and then these society women. We had Claire Hassel, who died, the Countess of Ivy, recently, who was on a lot of these flights and seems to have been again drawn into Epstein's circle. And it's all but kind of been covered up, but I mean, clearly was working with Epstein. So it's a very, very confused picture. And whether we'll ever get to the bottom of it, I just don't know, because clearly there's an omerta. People are not talking, and people, I think, are worried about mutually assured destruction and just keeping quiet.
Yeah, and I suppose another example there would be Princess Meta Merit, wouldn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we forget that actually Epstein was targeting royal families all over the world. There were these people who kind of swam into his ambit like Meta. I mean, we have all the scandals now in the Norwegian royal family, having previously had them in the Spanish royal family. And it makes sense that if you want to get involved with influential, powerful, rich people, targeting members of their royal families is a very obvious way to do it. And this is one of my arguments about the Yorks, that intelligence services were doing it quite apart from Epstein. And that's why there were so many Russian and Chinese spies sort of in Andrew's entourage, which is extraordinary. You would have thought he'd been warned off them by the intelligence services, and that they, at least someone above him, the Queen or King Charles, would have ensured that he, didn't have contact with them. But that doesn't seem to have happened.
And there are reports this week that the police investigations into Andrew are widening significantly, looking at both sexual crimes and further corruption crimes. What do you know about that?
Well, I only really know what I've read in the paper, but it is an encouraging sign. I mean, it's now got an operational name, which suggests there's an element of coordination between the various police forces. I think bringing corruption charges, much easier to do that than to try for a misconduct in public office. Di Davis has always said that any instrument should be used, any example of breaking the law should be followed up. And it does look like that's what they're doing. I think it would be very interesting. We've not heard from the National Crime Agency, and we've not heard from HMRC, because that would be two other areas who are other organizations who should be investigating it. We don't know if people like Amanda Thirsk, David Stern, Dominic Hampshire, a lot of these people who were working with Epstein and Andrew, if they've been questioned. But it does look like it's finally being taken seriously, and the police, I think, have realized that they do need to be seen to be delivering. At the same time, we're getting a lot of sort of mood music that, you know, the bar is too high, he may not get a fair trial, he wasn't a public servant. So, and to prepare the ground for things not happening. My own feeling is this is being probably going to be kicked into the long grass because, like the Burrell trial, the Royals will not want Andrew on the witness stand, and there will be found some way to avoid bringing charges against him, or at least having him testify.
And do you think it would be beneficial to the royal family if the charges were brought after King Charles died? So it seems to me that Charles is, at the very least, allegedly involved in breaking the Abuse of Honours Act of 1925, which just complicates the challenges with Andrew's corruption. And also just things like Charles accepted a £300,000 Rolls Royce within the last 5 years. Camilla's had some extraordinarily expensive gifts of jewelry from Saudi Arabia that we know about, that's most likely the tip of the iceberg. So with all the talk of the Yorks and their love of freebies, this is absolutely a family-wide obsession and a family-wide habit. So do you think if it so happened that Charles did very sadly die, say in the next year, that it would be easier for the police to bring charges and for the royals to ride it out with William on the throne?
Yeah, well, we've certainly seen, you know, the former Queen having to take the blame for a lot for in effect, a cover-up, even though actually Charles was, I think, ruling with her at a time when that cover-up was supposed to take place. But that would be a very convenient solution. I mean, the other theory is that Charles becomes the punch bag. He's the guy who initiates the reforms or starts them, and William then implements them, or gets the kudos for them. I think the problem that I've got is both Charles and William, I don't think, are pretty receptive to modernizing the royal family. They like it as it is, the secrecy, the fact that they get to keep all that money. And, you know, I think it will need quite a lot of public pressure and a real will from the government of the time to do anything. And I think a Labour government is the one more likely to do it than the Conservative one. Though, again, very interesting to see Tom Tugendhat talking in Parliament about Andrew committing treason, Robert Jenrick, who's now the Reform's Treasury spokesman, but was a Conservative cabinet minister, talking about Andrew facing justice. And so, you know, traditionally, we never had Conservatives criticising the royal family in any way. We're beginning to see that now. Again, one of the, I think, worrying developments is we had that parliamentary debate. It was purely because Andrew was an ordinary citizen rather than as a member of the royal family. But I know that both George Foulkes in the Lords and Baroness Boycott have put in a whole series of perfectly reasonable questions about Andrew and his trade trips, and they've not been answered months later. And it's very much the same line of basically the walls go up when you talk about the royals. And again, a very worrying editorial in the Sunday Times this week saying that the government is trying to rein back on freedom of information. But one of the devices they use, the exemptions, is the cost compliance one, that if it's going to cost more than £600 to research a question, and that's literally only a couple of hours of a civil servant's time, then they don't need to answer it. And they've dropped the £600 to £450. So again, a really easy way to stop questions being asked under FOI. So, you know, at a time when it's quite clear we need more scrutiny of our institutions, they are trying to evade it.
And I suppose Chris Bryant, who you mentioned there, is part of the problem, or an example of part of the problem, because, you know, 10, 15 years ago, he was very, very vocal about Andrew. And now that he's back in government, he's lost his voice. And that seems to be a pattern across all supposedly anti-monarchy or Republican MPs, that the closer they get to power, the less they're able or feel willing to talk about it.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, and I suppose they'll say it's to do with the responsibilities of office or whatever. But, you know, Chris Bryant, he was quite robust about Andrew in the parliamentary debate recently, but he certainly wouldn't talk to me, and I know him. But he was probably the leading critic of Andrew as a trade envoy, and he was in the Foreign Office actually at that time as a minister. So it's not that different to his position now. I suppose he may have felt it was easier to talk about it because he was a responsible minister. Now he's been moved. He was doing a very good job in arts, and they moved him out because he was doing a good job in arts, which seems to be the pattern. But yeah, it is frightening how easily politicians can be bought. I mean, William Hague knows a lot. He's former Foreign Secretary, now working for the Prince and Princess of Wales. He won't talk. Jack Straw, I talked to. I know he knows an awful lot. He claims he's only met Andrew once in some minor thing to do with Turkey. All those former heads of UKTI have never spoken. and they know exactly where all the bodies are buried. And I think they have a moral responsibility to the victims and to public interest and the truth and to law enforcement to speak out about what was happening. But of course, they allowed it to happen. They're actually involved in these scandals themselves.
So you appeared on Tom Sykes' brilliant new podcast, The Royalists, this week, and Tom revealed an extraordinary scoop, which was essentially that the Queen was not fully compos mentis by the year 2022. Can you just talk about the significance of that in the context of Andrew and Charles and this scandal?
Yeah, it was a fascinating thing. We had tea just a couple of days before I went on the podcast, and he was telling me the story of someone who had interviewed the Queen a few months before her death, and she was clearly suffering from dementia, and her staff knew that, and it clearly was being kept quiet. And anyway, Tom mentioned this because we both agreed that Charles did basically call the shots in the last few months or even years of her reign, and therefore has to take responsibility for the Andrew problem. And that's how it emerged. It's something I mentioned in passing when I was speaking at the Oxford Literary Festival this weekend. It's got picked up by the Times, and actually all the other papers have now picked up on the story today. So the Mirror, the Express, the Independent. But I think it's a huge story. And what's fascinating is the palace are not denying it. No one has come forward and saying, well, this is just usual rubbish that we get from Andrew Loney. Everyone's kept very quiet. And it would be fascinating to know from, let's say, people who did see her in those final months, politicians, for example, if that was their experience too. Because it clearly, the staff were being very protective of her. This clearly wasn't an isolated incident, her behavior to this person. And she was quite shielded. She was up at Balmoral. They kind of controlled the narrative, they controlled access, and they've controlled the story up till now. And so it'll be really interesting what might emerge. Let's say we've got a couple of biographies coming out in the next few weeks to mark her centenary of her birth, whether they will actually mention this or not.
But certainly the Queen was compos mentis 10 years ago, 15 years ago, when this scandal was white hot. And there's a really kind of powerful quote in your book where you say they knew exactly what was going on. People are not going to like it, but the Queen was colluding in this. I originally thought she just put her head in the sand, but I've increasingly come to the view that she knew exactly what was going on and allowed it to happen. Do you think that that's been borne out by the last few months of what we've learned?
Absolutely. And I think they've been slightly throwing her under the bus, but I think it's very clear that all the signals she sent out were to protect him, to use her own moral authority to suggest that the stories about him were not true, rewarding him with I think, Knight the Garter and Vice Admiral of the Navy after the Epstein allegations appeared. And it is extraordinary that nothing was done, after Sarah was taped selling access to Andrew after the Selman Turk case in 2022, when it was clear money had gone to the family, which they couldn't account for. And funny enough, I was talking to someone last week who is great friends with a senior member of the royal household. And he was saying that Andrew used to bully the Queen. So it wasn't that she, even quite early on, was basically, not just sort of charming her, but actually kind of bullying her. And he is a bully into doing things that suited him. And he certainly did that. He certainly ran to Mummy. She was his protectress. And again, there was a very interesting piece in the American intelligence report that I was given, talking about how Andrew was targeted because they knew he had protection in a way that other members of the royal family didn't, from the top. So, yeah, I think the Queen's reputation will change. I mean, it will be interesting to see. There are, I think, 3 books coming out, at least, on the Queen this next month, whether there's been a sort of shift in attitude towards her, or she's still being presented as this extraordinary Mother Teresa figure.
Yeah, I heard a really interesting line the other day in a book, I think by Peter Lacey, about William and Harry, but it was a quote from one of her courtiers. And they said that if the Queen had spent as much time rearing her horses as she did rearing her children, she wouldn't have had half the trouble that she had.
Yeah, I think the bad mothering is a persistent problem in the royal family. I mean, it's one of the problems I discovered with Edward VIII and Queen Mary. Again, quite a complex relationship there. Clearly, we know that Charles had quite a complex relationship with his parents, and people did feel kind of isolated and abandoned. I mean, the royals, and this was, I think, what's so interesting about the Queen. We always thought that she had sacrificed her family in order to be the monarch, to put the monarchy's interests first. And I think the shock is to discover that she didn't do that Andrew was protected in the way that Mrs. Thatcher protected Mark Thatcher. I read Mark Hollingsworth's book on Mrs. Thatcher recently, and It is extraordinary. I mean, she had, very strong moral boundaries. And yet when it came to her son, she kind of had a blind spot and did all sorts of, I would say, pretty dodgy things with regard to Mark Thatcher because he was her son. And it's now appearing the same thing happened with the Queen.
There was another really striking revelation in Entitled, which is that the Queen would allow Andrew to see the secret material from her red boxes. Now, we know that she wasn't particularly keen on doing this with Charles. We had the similar thing with Victoria and her son. Obviously, George VI very much included Elizabeth in that process from when she was really a very young girl. But did the Queen share such things with Charles, or was Andrew a special case in this way, do you think? And what's the significance of that in the context of the fact that we now know that he was sharing intelligence with the likes of Epstein?
Well, I just don't know what she shared with Charles. I would have thought, as we move towards, in effect, a regency towards the end of her life, she would have shared information with him as he took a more prominent role. But I do think it's worrying that she was sharing stuff with Andrew because he could be indiscreet. He, as you say, had these connections with Epstein, but also with Russian intelligence, Russian criminal gangs, Chinese spies. And you can see, that he was a vulnerable point in terms of getting access to secrets. So, I think that was very unwise of her if she was sharing this sort of information, because clearly she was briefed on everything. And I know she took a very keen interest, for example, in debriefs from the intelligence services. That's one of the first things that she read in the Red Box. So yeah, we as historians are constantly prevented from seeing very old material on the grounds of national security. And here the royal families are basically being pretty indiscreet in the way that they share the information they're privy to, which is, of course, much more current than anything that we were asking to see. So there's clearly a sort of double standards here. And I just hope that, perhaps they won't be able to play the national security get out of jail free card quite so often in future.
And there were photos this week of boxes being moved to Marsh Farm that had HRH on them. And there were also reports in the last few weeks that his staff are still to call him Sir. I suppose it's worth reminding everyone at the moment that he is still the Duke of York, that he is still His Royal Highness, technically. Do you think that behind the scenes he's still insisting on being treated like the royal that he considers himself to be?
Yes, I'm sure he is. I mean, it's so important for him. I mean, the idea of signing off your emails, KG, Knight of the Garter, just shows how important these little trinkets are to him. And it's all about respect, he would say, as the son of the Queen. I mean, he's behaved the same way with his daughters. He's very keen that they should retain their status. It was reasoned that they retained their security long after there was any perceived threat. And I mean, of course, Sarah Ferguson carried on using her HRH mainly to monetize what she was doing. And I mean, I noticed I was looking at some stuff she did with charities recently, her own charities, and she described herself as HRH, though that was removed when she got divorced. And of course, Meghan Markle has been using her HRH. They feel HRH is very important. It was the thing that most upset the Duke of Windsor, that Wallis, as the wife of a Royal Highness, couldn't call herself her Royal Highness. And for us, it seems meaningless. Who cares? But it's interesting that when Beatrice goes, for example, and does all her business opportunities in the Middle East, she always designates herself as Her Royal Highness Princess Beatrice, not as Mrs. Mabberley Mosey.
And there were also reports this week that Jean-Luc Brunel was going to flip and that he may well have been murdered because of this. Do we know anything kind of more about that? Do you think there's any credence to those reports?
Well, it wouldn't surprise me. We've had a lot of unexplained deaths in this whole story. There's a big debate. There's a big debate clearly about the death of Virginia Giuffre. There's quite a lot of, people are saying who knew her that she clearly she was in a very dark place at that point in terms of relations with her children and her husband, and that she finally flipped. There are others saying, well, it's very odd. She had a book about to come out. She had very obviously stated, not a long time before her death, that if she appeared suicidal, that was not the case. There's some questions around the death of Steve Hoffenberg, who was a close time associate of Epstein. A number of the victims have committed suicide, understandable given what they went through, but again, with stories that they might be prepared to spill the beans. And of course, the big mystery, which I think is becoming less of a mystery, is the death of Jeffrey Epstein. And I'm increasingly, I think with a lot of others, coming to the conclusion that he did not commit suicide.
Yeah, I mean, the evidence seems to be increasing all the time, even in the last few weeks. And finally, what do we know about Zorro, Epstein's property in New Mexico? So the investigators are currently scouring the property with corpse sniffing dogs. We know that Andrew stayed there. And there's been all sorts of things about whether there were eugenics experiments going on there. What do we know about Zorro and what do we know about Andrew's time there?
Well, we know very little about Zorro. There's one recorded incident where he went to Zorro, which we've got from I think a woman called who was the housekeeper there, Deirdre Stratton. But he may have gone there more often. I mean, clearly it's a very remote place, very easy to control the security. I think there were very strict NDAs on staff there, and even I think the one person who's spoken out, the son of like a caretaker, doesn't really know very much. But it is interesting. I mean, there have long been rumors about strange deaths, Zorro, possibly in rough sex. Whether sniffer dogs at this distance of time can discover anything, I think is a moot point. And the other interesting investigation is the one with Surrey Police, again stories of a strange incidents at an address in Surrey, which Andrew may have been involved in. Police, I understand, are trying to get more information from the Americans. I suppose we have to accept that now that the investigations are beginning, that we're not going to be briefed on some of these episodes to ensure that there's a fair trial, and maybe we just have to be patient. But I think I am more encouraged this week than I was last week that the police are taking this seriously on this side of the Atlantic, and I do hope that there will be reopened investigations on the other side of the Atlantic. And there must be other places. For example, a lot of the stuff went on in Paris, where Epstein had a flat where Andrew visited regularly. There's a victim that's come forward who says she was abused in France. So, and of course, there was a whole network, not just Jean-Luc Brunel, but other model bosses who were providing girls. So I think as time goes on, investigations begin to develop, and perhaps as we may get more material from the Epstein files, I hope we do, that more new information will emerge.
And finally, what's your instinct? What do you think he's most likely to be charged with first?
I think the sex trafficking allegations will be very hard to prove, to get people to appear in the witness box. Very difficult to show that they were trafficked as opposed to consensual. So I think it will be one of the financial irregularities, and they're countless. I mean, he broke company law, for example. There may be questions of fraud. I do think corruption is one of the corruption charges. I don't know which one would be an obvious one. I think that he leaked confidential information to, in effect, foreign powers, and that treason could still be a candidate. But I'm not privy to the investigation, so I don't know exactly what evidence they've got. But certainly the Epstein files give us chapter and verse of him passing on information, which was certainly insider trading, insider material, for example, on the Islamic banking crisis, on the government purchase of RBS. All this was secret information which he should not have shared, given the position that he was in and the access he had.